Good morning and welcome to this webinar. My name is Scott Mckenna. I am one of the patrons of Friends at the End. I am a parish minister in the Church of Scotland and have served as a part-time hospital chaplain. Today's conference is to discuss and reflect upon the social, spiritual, and emotional needs at the end of life. How do we care for the dying? To assist us in our thinking and discussion, we are blessed to have George Beuken, who is the head of Pastoral Care and Education at St Andrews Hospice in Airdrie, Lindsay van Dijk, who is a Humanist chaplain and chair of the non-religious Pastoral Support Network for Humanists UK, Karen Hedge, who is the National Director of Scottish Care, and Henry Marsh, a Fellow of the Royal College of Surgeons and was first appointed Consultant Neurosurgeon in 1987. Before we begin, I have some announcements, as it were, some intimations. First of all, to say that Fate, Friends at the End, have launched a professional counselling service, and it's available for anyone who needs their help. The counselling service can be accessed through contacting Fate, through perhaps Amanda, the Chief Executive, and we will pass on your request to the service. And you can certainly do that at the close of our conference today, if you wish. This session, this webinar, is being recorded. Although attendees will not be obvious or recorded, their identity won't be recorded, the discussion will be. And it's likely that Fate will use clips from this webinar, perhaps on promotional social media or their own website. The title of the conference was given to each of the speakers, and each speaker has responded and will respond in an individual capacity and from their own perspective. And I should just say a word of thanks to Sophie, who is the office manager, and she will be managing all the technical know-how throughout this webinar, for which I'm eternally grateful. We have a good, and I hope stimulating, agenda ahead of us. There will be opportunities, of course, for questions and discussion throughout the session. We're here to talk about the social, spiritual, and emotional needs of those who are at the end of life. In my own experience, and from the perspective of my spiritual tradition, in caring for those who are dying, we are stepping onto holy ground, into that space where human beings are often at their most vulnerable. It's important that we respond in our care to the whole person, what has been called their total pain. As our speakers will surely demonstrate, responding to human beings who are dying at the end of their life is a multidisciplinary team response. Again, from my own perspective, spiritual needs cannot easily be separated from physical and psychological ones. Human vulnerability means fear, and fear exacerbated by pain. And coming to the surface may be regrets, conflicts, the need for reconciliation, frustration, anger, guilt, shame, or indeed, perhaps by contrast, genuine thankfulness for the richness of a life lived. There may be a sense of loss of independence. Hope may seem childish, and there may be indignity, surely, and anguish, as well as unanswerable questions like, why me? In responding to human need, we are sitting with another, visiting, but not too long, listening, deeply listening, and always seeking to create a non-judgmental listening, a safe space. Again, from my own experience, sharing precious time with someone who is dying may be moments filled with loving silence, the comfort of intimate, tender prayer, and the sharing of God's love, peace, and shalom through affirmation of them. Moments shared with someone who is dying stay with us. The good moments, certainly, but also our sense of inadequacy. Part of our caring for someone who is dying is care also for their loved ones. Our presence, pastoral concern, and tenderness towards them matters also, whose perspectives and inner story will be different. However much one knows that death is coming, it is no easier to face for that. I hope these brief introductory remarks help shape the spirit and tone of our reflections this morning. Our first speaker is George Beuken. George is Head of Pastoral Care and Education at St Andrews Hospice in Airdrie. George is a registered chaplain and has been involved in hospice care since 1994 and has held his present post since 1999. He's responsible for patient and family support and education at the hospice. In addition to his academic qualifications in philosophy, psychology, and theology, George holds a certificate in social and pastoral ministry and is a registered MBTI facilitator. His thesis, Towards a Theology of Pastoral Care, has been published as a series of 4 articles in the Scottish Journal for Healthcare Chaplaincy. I could say more, and perhaps will say more about George if we get to the question and answer session, or indeed George may want to expand on his own biography. But let me hand over now to George for our first 5-minute presentation. George.
Thank you, Scott, and good morning to you and to everyone gathered. It's a privilege to be here this morning, and thanks to Amanda Ward for the invitation to be here. I heard one of my friends the other day describe a hospice chaplain being like a taxi driver for the hospice patient. The patient hops into the taxi and directs the chaplain where they would like to go. Sometimes patients don't know where they want to go, and chaplains can provide recommendations on where to go first. Chaplains drive the taxi as far or as short as the customer wants to go. Many journeys or excursions start by driving towards stories about where they were raised, turn left at the corner and start talking about their family, and then head over towards questions about feelings of loss. The chaplain drives the taxi wherever the hospice patient would like to go. In my own pastoral experience, I am acutely aware that when a patient receives significant news, or in particular bad news, that's the news that alters a person's view of the future. Very often that person then is pushed into an anticipatory grief reaction. The person's vision of the future has been changed forever, and suddenly the person finds themselves in a situation where they have absolutely no control over what's happening to them. When we start to think about loss and grief, many of us would think about loss and grief in relation to the death of a loved one. But I think it's important for us to realise that loss and grief isn't just about death. And when we start to think further, then we realise that transition loss is something that many of us will have experienced. Transition loss is threaded through most of our lives, and it manifests itself in such things as the loss of a dream, the loss of intimacy, the loss of direction in life, the loss of meaning and significance, the loss of the ability to work, the loss of health, and ultimately the loss of one's identity. sometimes the loss of hope and even the loss of faith. But then more significantly for most people, it seems to be the loss of control. All of us like to feel that we're in control of the direction of our lives. And yet, when we're faced with a life-limiting illness, and particularly with a short prognosis, then that control seems to escape us completely. Other people are around us making decisions. And we seem to be hostages to the care that we receive from the professionals. I think to begin to establish a sense of control back with patients at this particular time, it's important to have conversations around anticipatory care planning. What matters to the individual? What's important to the individual? And then taking that a step further to begin to explore options around care and around treatment. And very often, when people are faced with options around care and treatment, they defer the decisions to the professionals. So often we've heard the phrase from patients, well, whatever you think is best, doctor. I think when it comes to true shared decision making, we need to think of that as a three-step process. And that three-step process takes the form of three very different conversations. First of all, there's a conversation about choices. It's making people aware that they do have choices and they have the ability to make those choices. Following that then is the options talk. It's then discussing the options that are open to individuals and weighing up the burdens and the benefits of all of these options. And then finally, following a period of reflection, comes the decision conversation. And I would think following this pathway is the only way to truly reach a shared decision for a patient. Patients often too need to reflect their thoughts and their thinking around their care and treatment with their family. They need to discuss this with those close to them, and time needs to be allowed for that to happen. Hospice chaplains will provide spiritual support wherever support may be needed. They will do this through life review, through sharing stories of life meaning, or through helping to answer questions about mortality and beliefs about life after death. And as Scott's already mentioned, the chaplain provides spiritual support to family members also. Hospice chaplains will not replace any church affiliation or church leaders that are important and connected to the hospice patient. Instead, the hospice chaplain will be an additional support to any support the patient already receives from their church. The issues of loss and grief for patients can't be underestimated, and the triggers of that loss and grief are very often missed. One of the things that I see on a regular basis is patients who become distressed when visitors attend. And the trigger there seems to be that the presence of those close to them capitulate the patient into that sense of anticipatory grief. When they see someone they love, they realize what they're leaving behind. Often we experience patients having episodes of worsening pain when visitors are present, and yet when visitors leave, the patient can seem quite settled. This can also be quite disturbing for families because they see patients then in distress each time they visit, and of course are oblivious to what the root of that distress is. There are no easy answers to some of this. We just need to be with, that's all we can do. We need to go where the patient wants us to go, and we need to take our lead from them. I think I've exhausted my 5 minutes, and I'm very happy to take any questions.
George, thank you very much indeed. I should have said at the very beginning to all the attendees, and perhaps even to participants, the panelists, if you want to ask a question please go into the Q&A session, which you'll find at the bottom of your screen, or at least it's the bottom of my screen. And you should be able to upload a question which I can see, which myself and the panelists can see. You're very welcome to upload a question. When a speaker is speaking, it will not disturb them. And yeah, so any questions from attendees? Any questions at all? Please just type away furiously. Here's a question, that's good. George, please can you clarify the difference between choices and options?
Okay. When I speak of choices, it's helping people to understand that they do have choices, that decisions can be made, or they can make decisions for themselves. And it's when that understanding that there is a choice to be had is clear, then options can be presented.
Okay, I hope that helps. That's great. Another one. How do you best support someone when they are in denial and don't want to talk about choices or options?
Like I said earlier, my line quite simply is we take our lead from the patient. Many people will use denial as a coping strategy. And if it becomes clear that a person knows where they are on their life path and they are choosing not to talk about this and to deal with things in this way, then it's not for us to push them to talk about it. We need to support them in whatever way suits them best.
Okay. So next question. Do you believe there is a role for end of life in hospice movement? I mean, I presume we were talking about
End of life doulas.
Yes, yes.
Yeah, end of life. Well, yeah, I suppose the end of life doula would be very similar to a birthing partner.
Yeah.
Yeah, and if someone chose to have someone to journey with them through that, or through the gate of death, so to speak, then yes, there would be a role for that person.
Yeah, good. And then another question, how can we help and prepare families not to overburden the patients with confessions of sorry and forgive me and that sort of thing?
I think, again, it's supporting, listening to patients' families where they are at, where the individuals are at. It's helping them to meet the patient where the patient is. And it may well be that if there are issues of conciliation or reconciliation that the patient wants to achieve, it's asking families to be patient with that and allowing the patient to do that for themselves.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you very much. I think there will be later opportunity to ask questions of George and other panelists. So that's enough questions, I think, for now. We'll push on to our next speaker, who is Lindsay van Dijk. Lindsay has been trained at master's level in the Netherlands at the University of Humanistic Studies to provide humanist and existential counselling, coaching, and pastoral care. She additionally studied critical organisation and intervention skills at the same university, which focused on how to bring organisational change through humanistic interventions. This specialism explored issues related to humanisation and meanings of life through the UK Board of Healthcare Chaplaincy, the non-religious pastoral support network, and as a humanist funeral celebrant at Humanists UK. Lindsay has furthermore held various board positions within the education, healthcare, and humanistic field. There's much, much more I could say about Lindsay, and that may come out in due course. But what we're going to do now is Lindsay has prepared a video. We're going to switch to the video, and at the end of it, Lindsay will take questions. Thank you.
Hello, my name is Lindsay van Dijk and I run a large NHS hospital as lead chaplain, but I'm also a humanist pastoral care and a humanist celebrant, and I'll be speaking from a humanist standpoint today about end of life and euthanasia. I also want to share a bit more about a specific example where lots of people are talking to me with regards to feeling the urge of stepping out of life, which is not a light decision to make, and often very hard for those involved to come to such a decision, as there's not a lot of people they can talk to. Friends and family most often don't want to talk to their loved ones that they want to end their life. And of course, doctors, nurses, they're focused on treatment and helping that person get better and well. So it's very hard to discuss. Now, one gentleman I remember wanted to speak to me because he had nobody to turn to. He was in his 80s and he felt he led a completed life. He had a wife, he had children, he was happy, he had beautiful memories, and he looked back on those memories in his life and it was completed. And now he had cancer that was incurable, and he didn't want to drag out this whole route of illness, and he wanted to end it. But this, of course, is not legal within the UK. But I was able to offer a listening ear for him to voice his concerns and to talk to me openly about what would that mean and what would that look like and how would you feel about actually stepping out of life, relating back to the life that he led. So I want to share a bit more about Humanist UK's views, as well as, coming from the Netherlands, some topics around euthanasia there. Of course, within the UK, we operate within the law as everybody does. So if somebody discloses that they are going to do harm to oneself or harm to another, that would break confidentiality and would need to report that. So today I'm just sharing a bit about my personal experiences, but also a bit more about the legislation and standpoints to hopefully spark a debate. Now, just to give some examples of Humanist UK and some other examples of palliative care and assisted suicide. A number of campaign groups try to focus on assisted dying legislation only for those who are terminally ill with less than 6 months to live. And Humanist UK doesn't agree with that position, because there are people incurably suffering with long-term health conditions who are not going to die within 6 months, but who want the right to an assisted death too. And we should feel that, they're entitled to one as well. Fortunately, because assisted dying is now legal in other countries, there's more evidence coming through that good legal safeguards have been effective in avoiding this. Humanist UK would only want to see legislation with those solid safeguards in place. But they also want to see assisted dying offered within palliative care rather than as a separate or opposing option. The most popular is just to strengthen funding and access to palliative care, while also legalizing assisted dying. Some examples that could be mentioned is Canada and Oregon, where 90% of people who have assisted death exhaust palliative options beforehand. The main drawback with this approach is that in some countries, religious hospices tend to refuse assisted dying, which means that vulnerable people can be forced to travel sometimes far distances to end their life. Another option is to emulate the approach in the Benelux countries, which integrate both within the same care pathway. But as an example, in 2002, Belgium introduced the Palliative Care Act, which set out a right to palliative care alongside the decriminalization of assisted dying. In the northern Flanders region, palliative care therefore works as a complementary and integrated form of care, alongside assisted dying. For example, 70% of people requesting assisted deaths are likely to have received palliative care as well. Hence, the official Federation of Palliative Care in Flanders has said, palliative care and euthanasia are neither alternatives nor antagonistic. Euthanasia may be part of palliative care. Now, coming from Holland and the Netherlands, euthanasia was legalized there in 2001. Many churches in the Netherlands do not approve of the practice of euthanasia, and the majority of people choosing to end their lives this way probably would consider themselves non-religious. There are some bullet points of when euthanasia can take place in the Netherlands, which is when each of the following conditions are fulfilled, such as the patient's suffering is unbearable with no prospects of improvement, or the patient's request for euthanasia must be voluntary and persist over time. The request cannot be granted when under the influence of others or psychological illness or drugs. The patient must be fully aware of his or her condition, prospects, and options, and there must be consultation with at least one other independent doctor who needs to confirm the conditions mentioned above. The death must be carried out in a medically appropriate fashion by the doctor or patient, and the doctor must be present. The patient is at least 12 years old. Patients between 12 and 16 years of age require the consent of their parents. Now, there's lots more I can tell you about the process, but I want to open it up for debate, and I shared some of my experiences as well as, of course, the different perspectives in different countries on the view of euthanasia and assisted dying. So thank you for your time, and I'm looking forward to the questions and answers pod.
Lindsay, thank you very much. Excellent. I think perhaps just before we jump to Henry, there was a question which came in under chat for much indeed. We now have an opportunity for Q&A, for questions and answers. And so I would invite attendees to pop some questions in. You should feel free to put your questions in while the speaker is speaking. Any questions? Any questions? While you're thinking of questions, maybe I can give Lindsay 60 seconds. Do you want to add anything to your video?
Well, actually, recently, after I recorded the video, I think there was a message that 76% of the Scottish population actually would like to see assisted dying being discussed in Parliament, which is quite a large figure, of course. So it is something that we are looking more into, where people do think that it is a right or a choice for people to make themselves. I am aware, however, of course, that it's a very moral and a challenging subject to discuss from all different kinds of walks of life, may it be from different faith and belief backgrounds. And also, of course, like I said in the video, that it's not something that people come to across lightly. It is a very difficult procedure for some people to actually think about wanting to step out of life. So I wanted to spark that for some debate. And I can see that some questions are being put on the Q&A, I believe, at the moment.
That's great. Thank you very much. Obviously, one of the complicating issues in the UK and certainly in Scotland is the continued opposition of the BMA. But there's also been a survey, as you know, which has it says indicating perhaps a sea change, and let's hope that that is the case. And I think a significant change in the BMA to neutrality, I think, would change the climate entirely. Let's go to some questions. How can we be sure? How can you be sure that a patient is not being coerced? Some people are very good actors. Lindsay.
Yes. Of course, there are, well, from the Dutch point of view, I'm guessing to actually put that across, of course, from what I know from my country, is there are safeguarding in place. Also, of course, in the Benelux countries that we saw in the video, there's an extensive procedure to actually assess whether or not somebody has the capability to decide to step out of life, to have that assisted dying. So it's not just about the medical background, whether or not this person has so many months to live or if they're incurable. It's also about their psychological safeguarding to see whether or not they're capable to make this decision, which you can imagine is very hard because, of course, a lot of people may also find themselves in depression knowing that their life may end eventually anyway. But there are particular safeguardings in place.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for that. Is there a humanist principle or value related to the protection of life?
Well, of course, we all want to protect life in the sense of that everybody has a unique, valuable life to live. But at the same time as well, the humanist standpoint is that people are empowered to make choices of their own lives. We don't decide how we get into this world. We are all born, and that's not a choice that we consciously make. But actually how you step out of life is something that we can be consciously aware of and what our own kind of needs and desires are around that. I see a lot of people within hospital that are indeed like that gentleman that have led that completed life, that actually do not want to suffer and do not want to be remembered in the end about the long process of illness that almost identifies them. And I can often see that as well from the celebrate side of things, where people focus on that in particular, rather than the whole life that was before that illness. And that's sometimes unbearable for some people to actually think about, and they want to therefore remember the life that they led before that.
Thank you very much. Third question, you're being bombarded by questions. How are parents counselled through the decision of accepting the choice of the young person? So maybe a word about the process, because I think obviously safeguards are a big part of this. So process, how are parents counselled?
So that's the real hard part, of course, because a child between 12 and 16 does not have the capability to make that own decision. There's lots of conversations between psychologists, psychiatrists, between parents and child, so group sessions, as well as, of course, individually based. I must say most of those requests are often not granted because it's a very difficult procedure. A lot of parents do not want to, of course, have their child die on that such an early age. Most of the time, it does go more towards the physical conditions of the child to assess whether or not and how long this child has to live. Now, apart from the counseling of parents, of course, that is in the decision-making process that I've shown light on. But of course, the counseling also extends again to what this conference is about the social, spiritual, and emotional needs as well of the parents, because you can imagine that's a very challenging time for them. So they also have emotional safeguardings in place to actually deal with this very difficult request to assess whether or not their child has to have an assisted death.
And what would be those emotional safeguards in place?
So they often would get the option to get counseling or psychological, psychological interventions. So to focus on that emotional safeguarding for them as well through this very difficult process. And you can imagine the strain as well for the parents if they are in a relationship still, you don't know if they might be separated. So that might have an additional pressure on the relationships at home.
Excellent. Related to that, our next question, what is the process for young people aged 12 to 16 who request assisted dying? Again, the mechanism.
Yes. So that relates again to what I just kind of answered. It is that they can make that request, but they can't be granted that without the permission of their parents. Often that goes first by their GP. Most likely they have talked already to or a palliative care person that is part of their process, of course, as they should already be in a physical condition that is deteriorating. Most often they talk to the parents, but it really depends on how the relationship is with the parents, and they then can request through the GP to actually take it seriously as a request for assisted death. And then they would need to seek that approval from parents. Now you can imagine as well, it must be really challenging for children between 12 to 16 that might have a very strained relationship with their parents as well. And that's also something they need to take into account.
Okay, thank you very much. And there's a supplementary question to George, which I want to jump over because we're at the moment, and we'll focus on what we're saying to Lindsay. Lindsay says, thanks. Can you clarify the differences between, and very briefly here, this is a technical question, between the arrangements in Flanders and other parts of Belgium?
Yes. So particularly in Belgium, that was the act that they've put in place basically for the Palliative Care Act. So that was in 2002 that was introduced, where they basically tried to integrate the palliative care route alongside assisted death and dying. The other parts of Flanders, I think they have specifically as well that's in place where it's integrated, but I must say I must come back to that as well, that question, and I'll do some more extensive research.
It was a very hard question on to throw at you. And you've touched on this already, but just very, very briefly, how do they ensure that a young person requesting an assisted death is really clear what they're thinking?
So again, lots of safeguarding in place. So there's different conditions that I mentioned beforehand. So let me just indeed go back to those conditions. So it applies to any other adult as well. So they should have unbearable suffering. A request for euthanasia must be voluntary, persist over time, and cannot be granted when under the influence of others or psychological illnesses. So again, it's very much not just about the physical condition of the child, but again, the psychological underpinnings of how they came to that decision, and they need to be assessed as well psychologically, whether or not they're capable to come to that decision. Now, again, they can't come to that decision, as we saw before with the other questions, until as well they've got that consent from their parents, for which there's also a whole procedure. And to let you know as well, which I didn't say on the video, I believe, because there's a lot of information on that, GPs can actually deny the request for assisted death. And usually with a child involved, you can imagine that some may not want to actually partake in the assisted death of a child. They could refuse on the basis of their own belief, so their own religion as well.
Okay, thank you. Next question is a quotation from Atul Gawande in his book Being Mortal, who expresses concern that in some jurisdictions, palliative care has not been so well supported where MAID is available. He cites Holland in particular. Can you comment on that at all? You may not have read the book, or you may have, I don't know.
I have not read the book, but for about that palliative care has not been well supported, I think that really is a debate. I saw lots of articles as well from the UK base of that Holland may have been embracing assisted death and dying a bit too much. I think it's also very much related to cultural differences. I mean, I'm very comfortable talking about assisted death and dying because I am from a culture where that's very openly discussed, and also a culture where it's very much the right to choose. When coming to the UK, the integration is a bit more still from the perspective of religious underpinnings, where of course there is more of that question of why would you decide to end your own life if it's granted, for instance, if you come from a faith perspective, from something that's higher than us and should be higher than us. So that choice is a completely different way of approaching it then. But from the Dutch perspective, there are so many safeguards in place from professionals before they even come to that decision of granting assisted death and dying.
Okay, what percentage of patients in your experience request a conversation about assisted dying? In your experience, and presumably currently in the UK as well?
So in the hospital, I can relate to that. So it's a bit strange. I don't like the title, but I'm kind of branded like the suicide chaplain, which is a terrible title to have. But it's a title that I've got because people now know that I'm a humanist within hospital. And somehow they believe that because of my humanist title, which could be as well somebody that might be of a Christian background or Muslim, I seem to be more open to talk about death and dying. So people tend to seek me out if they have been thinking more about wanting to step out of life and not able to discuss that with their loved ones or with their clinical team, because of the focus with the clinical team, like I said, is mostly about how to make them more comfortable or how to get them better sometimes still. With the loved ones, they don't want to talk about, because who wants to talk about their loved one dying and wanting to step out of life before their natural ending is there. So I've had about, in the last 3 years that I've been there, I would say 15 conversations so far, mostly elderly people that have been wanting to talk about that they just want to step out of life. They're done. The struggle has been real, and they just want to leave this earth behind and remember the good times that they had rather than the pain that they're going through now. And there's lots of shame and guilt that comes with that, Scott, that you mentioned as well in your introduction, that shame and guilt that comes with actually recognizing what they're thinking and feeling.
Thank you very much indeed. On the question of coercion, is it also true that many people feel coerced to stay? What do you think?
Yes, it's very hard to have these conversations with patients that want to step out of life. I remember one conversation where there was a gentleman and his wife was always in the room. He really was open to talk to me about it, but she of course was overhearing him saying, I just want to step out, there's nothing to live for. I love my life. He wasn't depressed in any way, shape or form. He just felt it is time to go. I'm 88. I'm ready to go. Just let me go. I don't want all these medications. And she would actually come in to constantly say, you've got plenty to live for. You've got grandchildren. We were planning a trip as well to go around the world. So there is, of course, that coercion to stay in different perspectives, in different ways, of family members wanting to cling on as much as they can to the quantity of life, even if the quality might be affected. And of course, that is an emotional challenge for loved ones to see that maybe it's even more shortened than they already thought it was going to be, with a natural ending in sight.
You must be exhausted, Lindsay. Next question. In countries where assisted dying is legal, are people with long-term illnesses such as motor neuron disease or MS considered? Just briefly.
I wouldn't know that actually. So I think because it's a very slow process, especially of course with MS, it usually tends to be more end of life where certain organs or certain capabilities have already filled. So there's more an end of sight where there definitely seems to be a reduction in the quantity of life. Now, of course, within the UK, most of the people that are pleading, of course, for assisted dying, it's within the 6-month frame, which would be even harder for people with those conditions because you never know what happens within the last 6 months. So I wouldn't know that in particular. Sorry about that.
That's all right, actually. There are a couple of questions which are personal really to Lindsay, and person Janie Lazar wants really for you to make direct contact with her, and I'll let you do that. One of the issues, however, you could comment briefly, is she wants to talk about the interplay between a person who wants to die, but relatives who may have spiritual beliefs which are contrary to that. How do you manage that?
It's a lot of advocacy. So what George mentioned as well, it's very much person-centered, isn't it? It's about what that person wants to talk about, walking alongside their own needs, desires, and lend that listening ear within conformity of the law that we operate in. Of course, with people that have different perspectives, such as faith and beliefs within their own family or circle of friends, close friends, it is very hard because, again, the coercion question that we saw before, some people may actually guilt trip as well the feelings that are real for that particular loved one that wants to step out of life, that what they're doing is wrong, morally wrong. And we don't need that extra layer, of course, of guilt and shame, because a lot of the time people already do that themselves. It's already hard to come to that decision. So it's trying to find that space and time to talk to that patient themselves, to walk alongside their journey, to feel for them that they can actually express their own feelings, which often isn't allowed for them to do. And to sometimes as well ask them if they want us to advocate on their behalf and talk separately to family members, because they too are going through a very difficult time, and especially if they're coming from different viewpoints. Sometimes we also do that in the room if they're both willing to do that in an open conversation.
Thank you very much indeed. How do we reassure? This is obviously this was a big issue when Scotland considered assisted dying legislation. Both times when Margot and later Patrick Harvey tried to introduce legislation, one of the big issues and difficulties or issues that they faced was the issue of disability. And here's a question: how do we reassure disabled people who may be very uncomfortable with any perceived relaxation in the law?
So that disability is part of being recognized for assisted dying? Is that the question, Scott?
I think, as I understand it, and certainly the context in Scotland has been, there's a fear of a slippery slope, and that decisions will be made for disabled people because of their value of life. And do you understand where I'm coming from?
So that's the underpinning question, isn't it? The value of life and what we find valuable or not. But we have to be conscious and keep on reverting back to it should be the person's own decision. We are not basically putting people forward where we think they don't have a valuable life because of perhaps any disabilities that they may have. And again, if this person might be coerced, that is something that should come out of the safeguarding that should be in place with psychological assessments as well as the clinical assessments through GP practices, etc. But I think that is the underpinning, maybe the slippery slope of the value of life and our fears around what is a valuable life and when should we end it or when should we extend it.
Yeah, indeed, because certainly when it's been discussed in Scotland, there have been people who are disabled who will recite stories of doctors making decisions for them. And so that's the kind of the underlying kind of fear, really. So the next question then is to do with dementia. And should someone who has dementia a right to an assisted death, and in terms of can they make that decision much earlier and so on? So could you just talk around that issue briefly?
Yes, of course. So usually it's already, of course, too late when somebody has dementia or Alzheimer's because they might not be deemed fit enough to make the decision at that time for assisted death and dying. However, people can actually put in place care advance acts, so about how they want to step out of life. So it could be, for instance, that right now we will be writing kind of a palliative route, along with wanting to have assisted death and dying under certain conditions. Actually, my sister has put that in place as well. When she loses her mental capabilities for Alzheimer and dementia, she has decided that she wants assisted death and dying. And that's something by law that you can actually arrange within the Netherlands. Whether it's automatically granted is a different thing, but you can already put that in advance as advanced care planning, as a sense.
Thank you very much for that. Another question. Do you have to be resident in the Netherlands to benefit from assisted dying legislation there?
Yes. So the option of going to Switzerland, which is often, of course, the moral and ethical difficulty that we hear, if patients are really looking into assisted death and dying, they can choose to do that. But under law in the Netherlands, you have to be indeed a resident there.
Okay, thank you. Ian Chalmers has come back on his on the Q&A to say, helpfully, to say that his reason for asking the question about Flanders was because that it's not explicitly the case in other parts of Belgium, and the relationship between palliative care and assisted death. And he says, I believe that the Flemish arrangements meet my hopes for the focus of debates in the UK. In other words, different approaches in different parts. So thank you, Ian, for that response. That's excellent. Next question then, do some people find a sense of wanting to continue living? Now, gosh, there's a good question for a humanist speaker. Lindsay.
Sorry, I'm getting lost in the questions here. Do some people want to...
Rodis says, do some people find a sense of wanting to continue living again?
Some do, yes, absolutely. And it's not, if the decision is made and it's granted for assisted death and dying, that you have to follow through. That would be terrible, wouldn't it? That wouldn't be a very good legislation to then say you can't revert back if you do find that sense of purpose again. So that's why it's such an extensive procedure to actually exhaust all options before even having come to that point where the decision of assisted dying is granted. Because indeed, if there is something potentially still meaningful or purposeful to live for, then that should come through all of those different assessments and safeguardings in place. And some people may change their minds, absolutely, and they have the right again to do that too.
Okay, thank you very much for that. The final one really is a comment about if the Scottish Government and Scottish public support for euthanasia, or indeed some form of assisted death, is possible. Does it have to be Scottish or UK legislation? The answer to that is Scottish Parliament can do that itself, and has tried to do that itself twice now. And it doesn't need a UK authority to do that. We're almost ready to hear our next speaker, which is Karen Hedge. George, there was a question earlier to you. You may or may not want to take it, which is, it says, George mentioned the problem of loss of control and the need for options. Does he think that requesting assistance to step out of life should be one of the options?
I don't mind answering the question. Personally, no, I don't think that should be one of the options. In palliative care, we would see our role as helping people to live as well as they can until they die.
Okay, thank you for that. Thank you for that. Can I thank all the speakers, which is so far, that's great. And we've had some good discussions and good contributions and good questions. I want to move on now to Karen Hedge. Karen, are you ready? Karen is the National Director of Scottish Care. Karen's career in social work began as a paid carer, and whilst hugely rewarding, she quickly became motivated by the pressures of the sector. A champion for participation and co-production, she believes in evidencing impact through outcomes for people. Integration has been a theme of her career, having implemented the single shared assessment in an inner London borough, and has been one of the first people in the UK to have a joint funded NHS and local authority post commissioning in Wiltshire. As Director of Finance, Governance and Compliance at the Prince of Wales Foundation in Washington, DC, she held stewardship for fundraising and grant-making non-profit, reporting directly to Clarence House. As National Director of Scottish Care, she continues to shape the future of social work. Her portfolio includes reform, integration, commissioning and procurement and nursing in care. She particularly values the Scottish Care Awards, where she learns of the successes of the sector and from those who effect change. I could say more, as I've done with the others, but I want to pause and hand over to Karen for her 5-minute presentation and then some Q&A. Karen.
Thank you very much for a very grand introduction. But I really, before I move on, I'd really like to thank Lindsay. I found that an incredibly insightful presentation, and the conversations afterwards. I certainly got lots to go away and think about, if nothing else, memories of when I lived in Antwerp for a while. So yeah, I found, that's quite an act to follow. So thank you for that. I guess where I want to start is not with my own words, but more with the words of Ellie Jolly, who is a student. She's a nurse student and wants to work in social care. And she wrote this poem called Annie. I see tiredness and fear as I look into your eyes. So I take your shaking hand and place it straight into mine. Every time we speak, you say I make your day. I was so shy at first, I didn't know what to say. My words were slow and jumbled. What did you want to hear? You liked hearing about my friends, it seemed, and what I'd learned this year. I liked washing your hair as you'd hum with happiness, because we laughed about my weekend and all my clumsiness. The professional code states that we're not meant to be friends, but I've looked after you for weeks, and now we've reached the end. Your family couldn't make it in time. They live too far away, so it's just you and I sitting here. It's a bright and sunny day. You say something so quietly, so I listen for the words. They're the last thing you spoke, so I make sure that they're heard. I didn't get to meet you when your body was on your side. The view of patients' lives that nurses often get denied. You told me stories of the younger you and the family that you'd raised as I did things you once did for yourself. You pretended you weren't fazed. You were the first one to leave me, the first hand I held to the end, and despite my student nurse badge, I thought of you as a friend. I've sat with many others now, given them comfort by being there, but the room still goes cold each time, as if it's suddenly all bare. Every time I wipe the tears away that have fallen without consent, and I remember why I chose this path and what being your nurse meant. So what I want to talk about today is what we can do when we're supporting people at end of life. And this poem was written by Ellie Jolly, who was doing a placement in a care home at the time, and it's part of a care cameo called This Speaks to Me, which is a suite of resources developed as part of our Supporting Solace programme. Part of that, there's also a report called The Trees That Bend in the Wind, and it talks about the workforce experience of supporting people in palliative and end-of-life care. They spoke of anxiety, isolation, guilt, pain and bereavement, what it's like to break bad news, and all of this within the context of staff shortages and a lack of understanding about their role. I think it's really critical that you know that this research is now 3 years old, and we know that things have changed a lot in the last 6 months. People described being frustrated, sad, angry, guilty, have being set unrealistic expectations. We are responsible and accountable for providing palliative care. This is so often undervalued. What many people don't know is that more people die in a care home than in a hospital. Care homes today are like mini hospitals from before. 5 years ago, someone would drive to a care home and walk in through the front door. Nowadays, they arrive at a point of crisis, usually in a wheelchair and usually on a Friday afternoon. Care workers find themselves supporting not just those at end of life, but also their loved ones. Our workforce are experts in supporting people at end of life. And here's an example of the sort of thing they do. I want to be able to let them make a wish. Where would they like to die? Sitting on a beach, in town? If it's not practical, we could talk about this place, take them there in their mind. So they'll talk about things like the importance of anticipatory care plans. They'll support the person to remember aspects of their life using stories and sensory techniques. They create the conditions for compassion and for comfort. And then there was COVID. The last 6 months of pandemic response have been a microcosm of people's experience before COVID. We have seen 46% of COVID-related deaths occur in care homes. The implications of COVID have meant our care workers are taking on more of the end-of-life support role where family cannot due to restrictions, infection and illness. As we all know, Comfort is so important at the end, but there's also been practical learning as well. We've managed at times to cut through bureaucracy to focus simply on delivering good care and support. An example of this is medicines repurposing. So it's been a real ethical step forward where a medicine can be reused in the principles of good practice. For example, where there has been fragility in the supply chain, or if residents have deteriorated rapidly and they're in immediate need of treatment, but couldn't access the medicine in a timely manner or via other supply routes. Whilst we must celebrate the positives, this cannot and does not detract from the burden and the loss that we have seen recently. Care workers have lost residents and colleagues as a result of the virus. We're now seeing more managers leaving social care than ever before. Our workforce are tired. They've been on the go and under scrutiny since February. Many have not had time to stop and think about what they have experienced. It is at that moment that we risk a tsunami of grief. We need better wellbeing support for our staff, and there are steps towards that via the Promise.Scot movement, but critically, they also need the space to support that. There are visiting restrictions, funeral restrictions, a rethinking of how we access spiritual support. Thinking now, not only of care workers, lockdown visiting restrictions have seen the idea of presence narrowed down from the last few weeks and months to the last few hours of someone's life. As a community, as human beings, we have to notice and question what the impact of that will be. With restrictions and visiting, it's much harder for care home staff to support families of loved ones too. We need to undertake a mapping exercise of bereavement support across Scotland and a national survey on people's experiences of grief, as they have done in other countries such as Australia. Only then will we be able to hold back the tide and just be.
Okay, thank you very much indeed for that. And thank you very much indeed for that, Karen, much appreciated. Very tender stuff. So thank you very much for that. Questions? Questions? Or comments? Questions or gracious comments?
I'll accept ungracious ones too.
Yeah, not at all, not at all. Not at all. Okay not to have questions. It's okay not to have questions. Okay, that's fine. We can. There's oh, here's a question. Here's a question. Good. It says, please, can we have a link to the resources that Karen mentioned? Karen.
Yes, they are available on the Scottish Care website. If you go into our reports and you can put in trees that bend in the wind. There's also on our YouTube channel a short video clip on the trees that bend in the wind as well. And the care cameo is called This Speaks to Me. But if it's possible, when you send out some of the media around about this conference, I could see if it's possible to share the link there as well.
Perfect, perfect, that's good. Some questions coming in now, which is great. Karen, is there pastoral care? This is obviously very important. Is there pastoral care to staff in care homes?
Yes, there is. Although how coordinated that is unclear. However, in terms of COVID response, there has been a real step up in that space, and I am having a real mental blank of the name of the organisation, but you might know actually, Scott. There's an organisation that specifically looks at compassionate care and support at end of life, and they have offered support to all care staff, so not just care home staff, but care at home staff as well at this point in time. We've also had, outside of sort of chaplaincy support, we have had other organisations and hospices as well, working really closely with care staff, offering helpline support, but nothing formalised in the way that has been done sort of south of the border. In England, there was additional resource put into hospices to allow them to support care staff. Now, it's happened informally in Scotland, and that's been really, really welcomed, but additional resource would obviously help that.
Thank you for that. And following on then to issue of chaplaincy, do care homes that are part of a wider NHS trust make use of the chaplaincy department in hospitals?
So they could do, but actually would tend to link more to any religious institution or organization that the individual would previously have attended, depending on where they live or where they come from. So often people move to a care home in their own community. You know, you tend to move somewhere that's quite near where you live, or perhaps sometimes where your family live. So it might be that you already have links into sort of spiritual organizations, and those links would continue there rather than taking you away from relationships that you already have. We'd rather keep those existing ones going.
Quite so. This is obviously to do with lockdown. Next question is to do with lockdown, and how might the Scottish Government resolve the issues around families being unable to support their loved ones during lockdown?
So this is, of course, the big question of the moment, particularly as we're now in phase 2 of the resurgence of the virus. We clearly do not want to move back to a complete lockdown in care homes. It's so critical that people have access to their loved ones at this time. But we have seen greater introduction of technology. We have had support from Scottish Government and from various charities, and also from organisations such as BT, to get tech devices into care homes to allow people to make Skype calls, use the internet to be better connected to friends and family. We've also had the introduction of near me technology, which is a way of making those calls, but it's far more secure. So that's been able to help people to have more private conversations, in particular with health professionals, GPs, and so on. But clearly, we do have concerns about how we keep visiting going with the resurgence of the virus, and we have to wait and see what impact. In fact, there's a report coming out today from Scottish Government with further advice on where we might be going on that.
Okay, thank you. I think this is essentially the same question, but just in case you've got anything to add, Sharon asked, how creative are we thinking about relaxing visiting restrictions? For example, if family members have had COVID in the last couple of months, is there a possibility that they could visit loved ones in care homes?
Hi, Sharon. Unfortunately, the current thinking and research and science on COVID is actually that the antibodies don't remain in your body for very long. So if you had COVID a couple of months ago, you could possibly have it again. That's what we're seeing in the countries who were most recently affected by COVID. So even if we did have antibody testing in place, it might not allow that to happen. What would be better is that, and we are now seeing the development of this, so we're now seeing the creation of machines who can do quick turnaround tests. So they are currently incredibly expensive and very labor intensive, but clearly technology is moving at a really fast rate. So ideally, when these become more sophisticated and much more readily available and more reliable, then that is a possible solution, that visitors could be tested and staff could be tested before they're allowed to come into a care home.
Okay, and this is a kind of a follow-on as well, which is there the likelihood of care home residents, the families, raising human rights issues as of a right to a family life?
Absolutely, and please do. I mean, Scottish Care as an organisation is known for promoting a human rights-based approach to social care. That is one of our fundamental purposes as an organisation, is to ensure that is underpinning the way that we deliver care and support in care homes and in care at home. And there are various tenets to that. I guess what we also need to consider is what are the implications for safety for other residents in the care home, and it's the balance of that makes this such a challenging debate and challenging conversation.
It is a balance, isn't it? I mean, human rights are not an absolute right in that sense, really. It's not a Trump hole, really. Final question then from David Savage. Will the results of your research mapping on grief be publicly available?
David, this is not research that we're undertaking, but ourselves and a consortium of others, including SPPC, Life Changes Trust, are currently lobbying Scottish Government to undertake it, because it is happening already in other countries. So it's happening in England, it's happening in Australia. And I think there's a lot of learning that we could undertake from other countries and how they've tackled the current crisis that we could take on board locally as well.
Karen, splendid. Thank you very much indeed. Finally, may I turn to our final speaker, Dr. Henry Marsh. Henry read politics, philosophy and economics at Oxford University before studying medicine at the Royal Free Hospital in London. He became a fellow of the Royal College of Surgeons in '84, and as I say, appointed consultant neurosurgeon at Atkinson Morley's St George's Hospital in '87. He has been the subject of 2 major documentary films, Your Life in Their Hands in 2003, which won the Royal Television Society Gold Medal, and The English Surgeon in 2009, which won an Emmy. He was made a CBE by Her Majesty the Queen in 2010. His first book, Do No Harm, was met with critical acclaim and was a bestseller all over the world. This was followed by Admissions, published in 2017, which also received widespread acclaim. Henry has supported and worked extensively with neurosurgeons in the former Soviet Union, mainly in Ukraine, to modernize neurosurgery there along Western lines. He pioneered brain surgery under local anesthetic, allowing patients to converse with their surgeons whilst they operate, minimizing the risk of damaging eloquent parts of the brain. Again, I could say a little more, but I shall now hand over to Henry. Henry, welcome.
Thank you very much. To start with, just to say I am a passionate believer in assisted dying, and I regard the arrangements in Holland, where actually I grew up as a child, as being the sort of assisted dying nirvana. But what I want to talk about is the arguments against assisted dying. I suspect most of us here this morning are more or less in favor of it in one of its various forms. But I want to start with the fundamental point that, first of all, there are so-called 4 pillars of medical ethics, and one of these is patient autonomy. And the second point, as Lord Denning, the great judge, pointed out many years ago, it is rather paradoxical that it is not against the law to commit suicide. So why is it against the law to help somebody do something which is not against the law? Now, clearly, the opponents of assisted dying have to answer these 2 fundamental problems. Why should my right to autonomy, the right to be allowed the means to an easier death than might otherwise be the case, why should that be overridden? And why is it that it is illegal to help somebody else do it? Now, the various arguments presented against this, I will go through them one by one. The commonest complaint about assisted dying from the anti-assisted dying brigade, which is mainly in this country, as far as I can see, the Palliative Care Association, is that patients are vulnerable. And they use this word, patients are very vulnerable. Fair enough. But the question is, vulnerable to what? And I think the answer is they're vulnerable. When we are dying, we're vulnerable to 3 things. One is we're vulnerable to our own fears, which may be exaggerated. Secondly, we are in theory vulnerable to caring professionals who may want us to die prematurely. And thirdly, we might be vulnerable to greedy relatives who want to get hold of the family silver. Now, in terms of our own fears, I accept the argument. It's obvious in a sense that assisted dying is not a sort of Big Mac takeaway where you get given the suicide pill on the spot. And as Lindsay was saying so eloquently, in countries where assisted dying is legal, it is a long drawn out process. A very close friend of mine has just been diagnosed with Parkinson's and has now signed up for Dignitas, which is very expensive as well. But it's not an easy process. We're not talking about people saying, I want to die, and then this immediately being agreed. There is a prolonged process of negotiation, during which time people may well change their mind. And again, it's a process of negotiation with the family as well. So I simply don't see this argument against assisted dying. The patients are very vulnerable and will want to die very quickly. It does not apply when the standard safeguards are put into operation. What about vulnerable to caring professionals? Well, I think you've got to have a pretty gloomy view of your medical colleagues if you think that once assisted dying is legal, doctors and nurses will be hurrying patients to their death. I mean, we're not all Harold Shipmans. In fact, my own personal experience is that doctors find it very difficult to, and I speak for myself as well, I find it really hard to talk to my patients about, and their families, about inevitable death. Hopefully I got better at it with time, but my impression anecdotally is, again, this is simply not the case. As doctors, we are striving too hard often to keep patients alive. We all know in the profession, over-treatment is a huge problem now in modern medicine, where it's the doctors as much as the patients who find it very hard to face up to death. What about the greedy relatives? Well, my own view on that, first of all, as Lindsay was saying, with safeguards, all this will come out into the open. If somebody is being coerced into taking the suicide pill or whatever, that is going to be picked up by the process of safeguarding and negotiation, which assisted dying requires. And again, on a purely practical point, if the relationship between Granny and her family is so bad, but they're trying to persuade her to take the suicide pill or neglecting her so she gets so depressed she wants to take the suicide pill, I think it's rather unlikely she'll agree. And again, in human nature, again, anecdotally, my experience was, as other speakers have suggested as well, is often the family who find it harder to let go than the patient. We have to remember that love, in a sense, is very selfish. Dying, I won't miss anybody when I die, but my family will miss me. And I did pediatric neurosurgery. My own son had a brain tumor, although we were lucky he didn't die. But I saw many parents, in effect, so unable to let go, that they inflicted terrible suffering on their children. And this is a reflection that love is not a simple altruistic process. Love is a complicated social bilateral thing, which has many selfish elements. So that is my argument against the view that patients are very vulnerable and assisted dying will be exploited. The second argument is about autonomy. Now, there are some extraordinary things that have been written by the anti-assisted dying people. In particular, Iona Heath, who was a president of the Royal College of General Practitioners, she wrote something with a Danish colleague in the British Medical Journal recently, where she says one of the terrible problems about assisted dying is patients will not be exempt from having to make a choice. Patients will not be exempt from having to make a choice, which is a very Jesuitical way of saying patients will be given a choice. Well, what's wrong with that? Why shouldn't we be given a choice? And even more remarkably, she writes, a patient may already feel redundant when he or she, racked with despair, makes a rational request for assisted dying. This will be reinforced when he or she is met with a rational understanding that seems to exclude emotional understanding. Well, if we don't use reason and rationality in life, what do we use? This is, in fact, the most extraordinary statement of medical paternalism, verging almost on a sort of fascism, that we appeal to emotional understanding, which only the doctor knows. Patients do not know what's good for them. It may be rational, but the people like Dr. Heath and a colleague appeal to a higher understanding beyond human reason. Well, this is madness. This is irrationality. And if they have to resort to arguments like that, without wanting to use arguments ad hominem, you begin to think there's something else going on here, that they have such a bizarre twisted, not even logic approach. A third argument that's been used is that palliative care will suffer. If patients are all bumping themselves off left, right, and centre, hospices will be neglected. Well, as other speakers have said, the interesting thing about assisted dying is this is not an evidence-free zone. We have plenty of evidence, particularly from Oregon and also Benelux, that this is simply not the case. There is no evidence that introducing assisted dying has actually reduced funding and support for palliative care. And as, I can't remember the name of the book written by one of the Belgian palliative care doctors, assisted dying should be seen as part of palliative care, which leads me on to the next point, is that there is a profound hypocrisy, very typical certainly of the English, about so-called terminal sedation. We are not allowed to talk openly to our patients about the choice of assisted dying. We all know perfectly well if the dying is particularly unpleasant. And as a doctor, I have seen some very, very distressing deaths. The idea that palliative care makes it all a very fulfilling, painful, but wonderful experience is not true. It often does. I'm a passionate believer in palliative care. But sometimes dying can be very unpleasant indeed. And in these circumstances, we all know we use terminal sedation. I don't know any doctors of my generation who have not in the past helped patients on their way, although it's not something you ever talk about in future. That obviously has become much more difficult in recent years, which is not entirely a bad thing because of shipment and because of greater supervision and monitoring of what goes on. But what we have in this country at the moment is basically euthanasia without consent. And I think that point needs to be understood firmly. There's a deep dishonesty going on because we know perfectly well we will use large doses of diamorphine when necessary if the patient is really suffering. And yet you cannot openly discuss this. So it all has to be sort of brushed under the carpet. And my final point, as a surgeon doing very dangerous surgery, I retired finally last year. Whenever I operated, there was a risk the patient would come to harm. Now, what that meant was that, say, if I did 100 operations of a particular sort, 2 or 3 patients would be left terribly damaged or die. I didn't know, looking at the patient in front of me, whether that patient was going to be one of the lucky 97% or unlucky 3%. But you justify that risk of a few people coming to harm because a much greater number of patients will benefit. So even if the opponents of assisted dying are correct, and some people will be encouraged, for want of a better word, to a premature death unnecessarily, my own view is almost certainly, given all the evidence we have, but so many people in our country die badly. You saw that recent book published by Dijk, Death with Dignity, giving many, many stories of people dying very, very miserably, despite palliative care. Even if a few people come to harm prematurely, I think this is justified by the much greater benefit to many more people. I regard assisted dying rather like gay marriage. It's something which will come in time, and we all have to fight for it and campaign for it and persuade members of parliament. As we know, the great majority of people in both England and Scotland want it. It's a minority, a very vociferous minority of people who, for complicated reasons, are deeply opposed to it, well-meaning, but in fact, inadvertently often causing great suffering.
Henry, first class, many, many thanks for your contribution. Questions. I'm going to take some questions now, and so Charles Mercer has said, brilliant as usual.
Oh, thank you.
That's not a question, that's just a comment, but you're allowed to do comments. Any attendees who would like to probe or question, disagree, challenge, have a different perspective? Anyone anyone wants just to reinforce what's been said from their own experience?
And they've all been stunned by my brilliant logic.
There's Debbie wants to say just a word of thank you for sharing so openly. It's good to hear this opinion from a doctor, and it's certainly true. I would echo that. I mean, I think that we are kind of beat over the head by what the BMA says, and and that's a big factor. And I think that it would help our parliamentarians and perhaps the churches and others a lot if the BMA were to take a neutral stand. Yeah.
Well, my own view is assisted dying is not really a medical question. I mean, it's actually for the public. It's for the population who are going to die to decide what they want. Why should doctors tell us what we should do? I resent that deeply. Even though obviously doctors will be involved inevitably in the application of it. But I don't see why the doctors should have a say in what should be done.
And that's partly moving from a paternalistic society
exactly.
To one which is more individual human rights based. Absolutely. So someone's asking, how do we take forward these very ideas of Henry Marsh? I think
we have to support the organisations, the pressure groups that are campaigning for assisted dying. We need to write to MPs. If you read the Hansard debate in the House of Commons 3 or 4 years ago, it was appalling, unbelievable, the nonsense people were talking in Parliament. There was one MP woman who said that the drugs used for assisted dying could cause great suffering. That's not true. It's true with using drugs for execution in America, which often don't work, instead of the electric chair. But it's simply false. And the quality of the debate was really dreadful. It's the MPs who need to be educated.
Thank you for that. Are there any questions? What I plan to do is we'll take, if there's any questions that come up, we'll certainly take them now. And then I thought we might have a 4-minute comfort break and then come back. Does that make sense to people? Because I think it's important people are able to kind of get up from their chair and exercise. And so 4 minutes, and I'll tell you that in a minute. Okay, let me have a look at some of the questions here. The playing field is no longer level, says Bob. It's harder, well nigh impossible for doctors to compassionately assist their patients to die. Do you agree with that, Henry?
Well, as I said, I think my generation of doctors easing the passing, as the phrase was often practiced. Actually, in a sense, I think that was wrong because it was done without proper discussion. It was all sort of, the famous story of the doctor who bumped off King George VI to fit in with a daily schedule or something. I mean, it is more difficult. It is very difficult indeed now because there's much more awareness and because of Harold Shipman. But I think the answer is it needs to be discussed openly. We should have, doctors need to have open discussions at the end of life with patients as to what the options are.
And Sue is also asking about, her MP supports assisted dying. What else can she do to take the arguments forward? I suppose you've indicated it's important to write to MPs. And
support the organisations. I mean, in England, there's Death with Dignity, which is only for 6 months. I support that financially, but my heart is with My Death, My Decision, the group with Ian Chalmers and others, where we favour a Dutch solution. Because the other thing to make is modern society is profoundly different from the one we evolved in hundreds of thousands of years ago. Many of us will live long enough to get dementia, and many of us, including myself, have seen parents dying from dementia. And a very important point to this, as Lindsay was saying, is we remember people as they were at the end. My mother died fully in possession of her faculties from metastatic breast cancer at the age of 82, and I have wonderful memories of her. My father died at the age of 96 from Alzheimer's. It took about 10, 15 years. And I'm afraid I remember him as a wreck, and he was a very, very distinguished human rights lawyer. And this is, for me, I may not live long enough to get dementia, but for me, the idea that I can write an advanced directive which says, if I become profoundly demented, I would like me to be put up to the extermination board for consideration. That's wonderful relief for one of my very profound fears. Ditto, if, as I may well have, I get cancer. And now we know there's some Oregon, many people going into palliative care when they have a final terminal diagnosis express an interest in assisted dying, but in the event, don't then take that option up. Now, the relief to feel that if my death is going to be particularly unpleasant, and I've seen people dying from frozen pelvis and also multiple fecal, terrible things, terrible, terrible things. Mainly in my years before I became a brain surgeon. The good thing about brain surgery is your patients die comfortably from coma, in coma, and the suffering is mainly the families. But the idea that I do not face the possibility of a really very drawn out, protracted death is an enormous psychological relief. I know many medical friends whose parents were doctors who said, I don't want to, I don't want to die, bump me off, please, whatever. But in the event when it came, they didn't talk about it and they let nature take its course, often developing what's called cognitive dissonance or hysterical dissociation. My mother did that. One day she'd be planning her funeral, what music to play. She'd be dictating letters for me to send to her friends, saying goodbye. And next day she'd be talking as if she wasn't going to die. And many of us do that. And I've seen that in patients as well, which is why, not that I did much palliative care, but given the nature of my work, you're often talking to two different people almost in the same patient. But the possibility of assisted dying, I think, is hugely important, even just for the 6 months thing. And then the broader definition, we don't have to worry about eking out years miserably in a care home with dementia. I'm not slagging off dements, but purely for myself, that's not a future I want, nor do I want to be a burden to my family. And I think not wanting to be a burden on one's family is a very reasonable, respectable wish as a parent and as a grandparent.
Okay, thank you very much for that. And that was certainly one of the questions on chat, obviously. And obviously you mentioned the issue of almost the memories that haunt you, and that's not nothing. The memories of a dying loved one, that's not nothing. Dovetailing with what you've said, the next question is, why do you think doctors are generally against this? I mean, it might be useful for you to expand that into the, what is the psychology of doctors? What are they frightened of? Is it personal? Is it professional? What's going on there?
There was a book published a couple of years ago about psychiatric problems in doctors. It was mainly in young doctors and medical students. So the subtitle of the book was, I can't remember what it was now. But there was a very favorable chapter where the author follows a palliative care doctor around and says, all doctors have so much to learn from palliative care doctors, and compared the palliative care doctor very unfavorably with some of the non-palliative care consultants. The book was written by a psychologist, and it struck me as quite remarkable mistake. When you're trying to keep people alive, you have to make risky, difficult decisions, particularly in areas like surgery. When you're in palliative care, and I don't mean this in a condescending or dismissive way, it's sort of comfort care. Comfort in the broadest sense, spiritual, holistic, the works, physical as well. But when you're actually still treating patients, doing difficult, dangerous, scary things to them, you have to develop these defense mechanisms for yourself to protect yourself from your patient's suffering and the fact you might get it wrong. And we're all, as doctors, we're all worried about failure, and basically we regard death as failure, as well as which also we are human beings, and as we've all been saying, it is very difficult to think about death, both one's own and people you love and your patients. And I think it's built into doctors, we regard death as a failure. In one of my books, I tell the story of a patient I looked after for about 15 years with a slowly progressive brain tumor. And eventually, he and I sort of made the decision no more. I could have operated again, and we decided no. And it was strangely fulfilling for me. It was terribly painful. I was in floods of tears, but it was the right decision. But my God, it's difficult to do that, to say no, to say it's time to die. I cannot tell you how difficult it is. I can think of other patients where I went on too long and actually it made things much, much worse, even though that's what the family wanted, because I held out the option. It is really, as I said before, it is really difficult as a doctor to say time to stop. Maybe easier when people are much older. And this, of course, is what COVID is partly about, because the great majority of deaths from COVID are in people in their 80s. And should these people be admitted to hospital in the first place? Should they be ventilated? Very, very difficult questions, which we don't have time to discuss.
Right.
But the answer to the question is yes, doctors find it very difficult to, they're once frightened of being wrong. You know, I always illustrate this by saying when I was doing emergency work, I'd be rung up at night and shown a brain scan over the internet, and usually sort of hemorrhages, but where we knew if the patient lived, they'd be left damaged and disabled. And if we didn't operate, they'd probably die. And I had to make a quick assessment, because you had to operate, either we operated urgently or not. Is the probable quality of life the patient will have after this hemorrhage or head injury worth it? If I said, go ahead and operate, like Nero in the Roman games, I got back to sleep. If I said, no, let them die, I couldn't get back to sleep because I was so worried I might be wrong. So there is this built-in ratchet, which makes it very difficult for us to accept death because we're always worried we might be wrong.
Thank you very much for that. I want to try and really move to our break soon. So very quickly then, what's your opinion about pushing for a referendum on this subject? A referendum rather than parliamentary decision?
Well, I mean, a referendum, according to the opinion polls, should show a strong majority in favour of it. How you set up a referendum, I don't know. It's an option I think the assisted dying organisations ought to contemplate, but referenda have got rather a bad reputation because of recent years.
Yes, we'll not go down that road. Okay. So next comment simply saying well, it's difficult for us to talk about death in this country, and that's surely part of the issue as well. Here's a comment from Charles Mercer. How can dignity in dying be persuaded to drop the 6-month criterion? And I'm advised that Fate is not in support of the 6-month criterion, but any comments about that, Henry? Well,
the Welsh branch of Dignity in Dying has recently dumped the 6-month business. I think the organisation, its original parent organisation, which was the Voluntary Euthanasia Society, I think, did not have the 6-month rule. And then Dignity in Dying brought it in. I think they brought it in on the sort of pragmatic ground that they were worried by the argument produced by the anti-assisted dying people that this was a slippery slope to wide-scale euthanasia, a la Dr. Mengele and the Nazis and everything else. But it doesn't, I think the opinion polls don't suggest people actually talk about suffering as a whole, not just 6 months. I don't know how one could persuade death and, well, I'm supporting MD, you know, as a separate campaign for the broader criteria. Again, coming back, I mean, the interesting thing is you cannot, assisted dying is a non-issue in Germany because of the Nazi euthanasia program. And you have to, you know, and Holland has always been a remarkably liberal and progressive country. And you have to look at the cultural background. And the English have this, traditionally, we are not very good at talking about our feelings. So that might be one reason why we're behind some European countries in this question.
That's fine. Okay, folks, welcome back. And if you make sure for speaking that your microphones are on, that's great. So this is a general discussion area, but we have still 4 comments on the question and answer, Q&A. So I'll deal with those first, and then other questions can come in as we proceed. And at the very extreme, we will stop at 12:15. So it's about 30 minutes if we need to. So the first question then is, I'm interested in Dr. Marsh's suggestion that personal autonomy is extremely important in this. And of course, that conflicts at times with doctor's opinion, and doctor's opinion apparently prevailing. And so the question is, do we have to arrive at that situation by incrementalism that people can make their own decisions? Can we pass laws that don't provide, that provide for personal autonomy? Can we pass laws that provide for personal autonomy, which trumps everything else? Henry, do you want to kind of respond to that?
Well, I was interested in what one of the speakers said earlier, but in Belgium, assisted dying was written up as part of human rights legislation. I'm not sure, I don't know the details. And again, because of Brexit, I don't know whether human rights legislation now will apply in this country or not. But I would have thought, you'll need separate legislation to enable assisted dying. I wouldn't have thought we could get there via the back route of legislation about personal autonomy. But I mean, again, in a sense, that's a question for lawyers to answer rather than me.
Okay, thank you for that. I should also say to the other panelists that we're now in an open session. If you want to chip in, agree or disagree, or offer a different perspective, feel free to do that. That would be great. Tracy Leishman said, I'm trying to establish myself as an end-of-life doula. It's very difficult because no one wants to think about this or discuss death. Does anyone want to comment on that, or the issue around that? Possibly.
Yeah, I could comment on that.
Yes, George.
Scott, I think there is a big issue, a cultural issue within both Scotland and in England around conversations around death, dying and bereavement. And I know in my own health board area in Lanarkshire, we've done a lot of work trying to address the great taboo, so to speak. Personally, I believe that this is a public health issue, that we need to be encouraging people to be able to be as comfortable talking about death and dying as they are comfortable talking about sex. At this point in time, and until the conversations can be had openly, then we are going to be stuck where we are. There are two particularly good websites on the subject at the moment that help to promote the conversations around death and dying. And one, of course, is Good Life, Good Death, Good Grief. And the other is a national-based website, which is Dying Matters. Lots of good resources on both of these websites. And of course, this week, 1st of November to the week from the 1st of November is the Absent Friends Week that's hosted on the Good Life, Good Death, Good Grief website. And it means as a way of trying to encourage people to have conversations.
Thank you very much for that, and that's a good resource. Thank you very much for that. Helen Jackie Clydesdale, what are the speaker's views on the increasing use of terminology regarding death? For example, to pass away, or passed away, or as opposed to die and dead. It seems that young doctors are even using these terms on death certificates. Comments? Lindsay?
Yes, I really hate the terminology of pass away or pass on or anything of the sort. We need to start calling it as it is, death and dying. And I actually really compliment my palliative care team that usually uses that language when they're trying to make clear to a patient that they are going to die. And I think what the taboos are within the UK is generally also shouted through the language that we use. So by using language such as passing on, it already indicates that we have a cultural difficulty to actually address that we all are going to die eventually. We're not immortal. And I think that is the start where we have to change our language to start overcoming that taboo that is so coming through the different chats as well.
I very much agree. I hate this phrase past. But having said that, I must confess, when I was talking to families mainly, I often find it very difficult. I usually forced myself to do it, but I had to make an effort to say die, or rather than use some vague phrase. And again, when I nursed with my sister, who was a nurse, I did the terminal care for my mother over a period of weeks. And actually, I found it very hard to use the word death or dying, even though that's what we were talking about. It is difficult, but I agree with Lindsay, it's something we must do and must practice doing, and we must set an example if we're teaching and training the people to do that. Call a spade a spade. If you don't do that, you'll never get started.
The one might provocatively say these terms are not mutually exclusive. It seems to me that they both, there's an aspect of both in passing away as well. George, do you want to come in on any of this?
Yeah, I quite agree with what's been said here. The language has got to be really clear, and we have a policy in hospice where we don't use euphemisms for death and dying. We talk about people dying, or people having died, or people being dead.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you for that. That's good. Moving on, Amanda asks, any thoughts? This is probably for Karen initially, at least. Any thoughts on why the stigma around care homes persists, much in the same way as hospices. We need people to see that care homes are places to continue living, not where you go to die. This might remove some of the fear, hesitance to go into a care home. Karen, do you want to start off and comment on the stigma around care homes?
Sure, yeah. I mean, it's well known, and even my kids are 7 and 9. I had to think there because the birthday was a couple of weeks ago. It's not that I don't know how old my kids are. So, and one of their current favorite authors even writes about older people in care homes in a fairly derogatory way. It's the way that we converse, and I suppose it's similar to those misconceptions in the use of the words pass away and dying. It's how we have, grown to associate and think of these places and to think of these processes. I think as more and more of us have relatives who are living in care homes, that's starting to change. Sorry, now I've forgotten the statistics of how many people live in a care home, but 1 in 3 of us have a relative or know of a loved one who's living in a care home. And that experience, that exposure, helps to see what they really are. One of the things that Scottish Care does through its care awards is sort of promote what that good experience is in a care home. And we know that actually for many people, and this is very stereotypical and very generalist, but as women currently generally live longer than men, often what happens is they have cared for their husband until end of life. So we have a larger proportion of women than men in care homes. And then what we find is they're very lonely at home. And when they come to move into a care home, they, reignite friendships and companionships and relationships with the other people who live in there. And we hear stories of people coming alive when they live in a care home due to that rekindling of those relationships. So there's certainly things that can be done to showcase those different attitudes. And actually we have a really nice short film, what good care looks like. So I'll put the link of that in here. Do you mind if I also pick up the question about personal autonomy in these conversations?
Please do.
As what was going through my head was at the beginning of the coronavirus crisis, what we found was that many people found do not resuscitate was automatically put into their notes, and they were asked to sign it, but without the context of the conversation that needs to go alongside these processes. That's almost looking at it from the complete opposite lens. So I would really, really like to reinforce that whatever happens as a result of the campaigning and so on, this has to be about informed choice. People need to be able to make those decisions on the understanding of the context and what's available to them. And I think I just really wanted to make that clear from our perspective, is that informed choice is what's important here.
It reminds me of how a few years ago the Daily Mail had it in for the so-called Liverpool care pathway, which was the upgraded version of what we used to call tender loving care, which essentially was terminal sedation. But the whole point about the Liverpool care pathway, if properly applied, was it was done after detailed discussion with the family and usually the patient. And that wasn't being done. So the criticism wasn't of the care pathway, it was the way it was being applied.
And I suppose that's part of why sometimes those who oppose assisted dying, these are the kind of instances that people will cite as areas of concern. When DNR appears in your notes and there's been no conversation, that kind of story does not help.
The other relevant thing there is this worry about disability, where some people have got the wrong idea that assisted dying is about licensing doctors to kill patients. Mm-hmm. And Brian Ricks, you may have seen, the famous farcer actor and a stalwart supporter of mental health charities because he had a child with Down syndrome, voted against it in the House of Lords because he had this idea that disabled people were going to be disadvantaged and bumped off in some way. And then a couple of years later, he was dying himself, and he wrote a very, very moving letter to the Speaker of the House of Lords saying, I was wrong, and actually lying here in the middle of the night waiting to die is a completely miserable experience. And I didn't understand the issues, and I want to put it on record. I was wrong to oppose it. And I understand now it's got nothing to do with, you know, exploiting disabled people.
Thank you for that. One attendee, Ari, says, in the issue of maid, in my view, the issue of not wanting to be a burden is a perfectly valid one. As a widow with no children or siblings in this country, I cannot expect my friends to put their lives on hold to care for me for an indefinite time. And we've certainly spoken about that issue of burden and who makes those decisions. That's certainly been part of our discussion so far. Any further questions? Any further questions, comments, observations, disagreements?
I just wanted to add as well that it just strikes me in more of a philosophical context that actually our whole purpose and meaning of life is derived through the notion that we're all going to die. We have a limited time on earth basically to fulfill what we want to fulfill. And hence that's why sometimes it's so baffling for me that we seem to ignore the part of that death is part of life, and that actually it's a beautiful part of life, because if we didn't have it, we would have endless time to do what? Because of this urgency that we only have a limited amount of years on this planet, we can actually fulfill beautiful lives. So why aren't we discussing what also a good death looks like?
I think the answer to that
terrible
probably is evolution. Humanly, we evolved in an environment where it was very important young parents avoided death and were frightened by dangerous things so that their children would survive and their DNA would survive. We have this peculiar problem in modern life. We live well beyond our period of biological usefulness. I'm not being reductionist. And hence we have this deep philosophical problem. And also, because of modern medicine, this is unique now to us. Often our death is predicted months or even years in advance. Our great-grandparents didn't have to deal with this. Once you were dying, you were ill and you died, usually fairly quickly. And the situation we face now is completely unique in the history of our evolution. And our brains, our feelings, our culture have not yet really caught up with the reality of old age and early diagnosis of cancer. And cancer, of course, is essentially a disease of old age, and dementia, which again is essentially a disease of old age.
So can I then pose a difficult moral question, actually, because that is something that's just on my mind. And I'm Dutch, so I speak my mind.
You're very in the face to Dutch, I know that.
Is it then indeed that survival instinct that makes us not want to discuss this taboo of end of life? Or is it also on top of that, and I know I'm coming from a humanist point of view, that religiosity within our culture of the UK is very much still on the opposing side? Not all of them, but drives that force perhaps of not wanting to talk about end of life, because potentially that view of that our life is not ours, that it is actually something that is beyond our own human existence and hence linked to a higher power of God, and therefore almost not undermining, but questioning the autonomy of our own lives. And I know that's a very moral, difficult question, and I know I'm coming from a humanist background, but that is something that is still, I think, innate within UK culture. And I think it can live alongside each other too.
I mean, England certainly is an increasingly secular society. I can't remember the figures, but the number of people who go to church regularly is really very small. But of course, the Church of England is part of the establishment. You have the bishops and the House of Lords. So there's a political aspect to that. And the fact that on the whole, English society, I can't speak for Scotland, is a rather deferential, law-abiding society. And I think that's one of the many elements feeding into this. But having said that, the ground is shifting. The BMA has changed its view. The Royal College of General Practitioners has changed. The Royal College of Physicians has changed. And opinion polls show a clear majority. So it will come. The question is, will it come in time for me? That's my big question.
Splendid. Karen, you were going to come in.
Just to come in with Lindsay about your question about whether or not religiosity, I can't even say it, goodness me, has an impact on our ability to discuss death. When I was working in Hackney, as a social worker, I spent a lot of time working with the Hasidic Jewish population. And for many reasons, partly also down to population and size and so on, and many of them had children with fairly profound and complex and multiple disabilities, and I found myself in instances where those children were in pain. So it was possible to have complex conversations about pain, experience, death and dying, and long-term implications in a secular way within that particular diaspora. So yes, I guess there's something there about the systems and the institutions and what they believe, but there's what's happening with the practitioners on the ground and how they're holding those conversations. Maybe that comes back to what we were discussing earlier, and that shift in that ability to say die, in using that in our everyday language, rather than in hiding behind what I suppose, I guess, a mask otherwise.
Not everyone would say it's a mask. Any other comments following on from Lindsay's philosophical interjection about religiosity? Okay, question from Kathleen. Could a better social care system remove the feeling of being a burden from older years? Are families being overwhelmed by care a symptom of a social care system that doesn't support families anymore? So are there issues around burden and social care provision? And Karen, do you want to start off on that?
Sure, yes. And you might need to stop me because this is a topic close to my heart. But one of the significant issues that we currently have for social care, and I'm talking specific to Scotland, it is slightly different in England, but pretty much in the same ballpark. Over the last few years, due to changing demographics and basically fundamentally the finances available to pay for social care, we've seen quite a significant shift in the way that social care is delivered. So in Scotland, we have the right laws, we have the right policies in place to have person-led care and support. So people get the care that they want in the form that they want, and they access it when they want. The policy and the law is there. What is not there is the money and the ability to make commissioning decisions that sort of look at everything that you have around about you in your community that can be used to the best effect. And that's purely because of demographics and the amount of money coming into the system. So the challenge that we have is that we're starting to see eligibility criteria rising. So the point at which people can get care and support is much, much later than what they used to be able to. So we're moving away from what we used to call a preventative model to really crisis intervention. The Glasgow Disability Alliance put a really interesting and pretty damning report actually earlier on in COVID response. It's worth having a look at, that was talking about this marked shift in the way that care and support was delivered in early COVID response times, because they were trying to reduce infection and reduce footfall, but actually what happened is we just had loads of families left hanging with no care and support. And now what we're seeing as a result of that is a significant number of people requiring emergency respite. So there's the deterioration that's happened because they've not had the right care and support. So we need to rethink, we need to be thinking about this differently. How, and we have the adult social care review underway in Scotland, led by Derek Feely and his team. So there's a real opportunity to have transparent conversations actually about how we can do this. Because if we shift back into the preventative space, then we're enabling people to contribute to their societies for longer, to live a fuller life for longer as well. And there's also the economic value attached to that as well. So at the moment, social care is an economic contributor to Scotland of 3.4 billion, which is more than agriculture, forestry and fishing. So the context of this is far, far bigger. If we allow people to live healthier, more able lives for longer, then the opportunities are greater.
Okay, thank you very much for that. And obviously related to that, Sue's put in a comment talking about how this dovetails with human rights. But again, that's an issue of there's the right and then there's the actual resources that back up that right as well. That's all good. Thank you for that. Someone, Mary Cosser, I think, has said to the panelists that not all spiritual people, spiritual Christian people go to church, and that the same people have opinions on assisted dying and death, and you don't have to have a specific faith to have an opinion against it. And that's absolutely, I'm sure that is the case. It's a spectrum of views always. That's certainly true in the BMA. It's certainly true in my own faith tradition. And there's a spectrum of views. And those views are held for varying reasons. So I think that's a helpful comment, Mary. Any more questions? Penetrating questions. We're coming to the close of our time. And what I'm going to do shortly, if there are no more questions, is ask each of the four panelists to offer 60 seconds. You get a 60-second slot to say anything you want to add that you maybe haven't said already. So I'll give you 60 seconds shortly. But are there any other questions? Any other questions from attendees? We're probably all exhausted. Need lunch. Okay, well, there are no, I don't think any questions. Oh, there's a question coming in. Oh, dear Scott, that's not a question, but it's kind of you to say. We'll maybe come back to that. While we're waiting, because we are approaching time, and I do want the panelists to have the chance to say anything they want to say so they don't feel they've missed an opportunity. So you have 60 seconds, and George, you were first. Is there anything you want to come back with, you want to finish off with, you want to leave us with?
I just pick up on Mary's comment earlier in terms of people, Christian people who go to church and people who don't. One of the common phenomenon today is working with people of faith who have no regular religious practice or no affiliation to any particular religious tradition. It's very common, and certainly that group of people will have mixed views in terms of assisted dying. Okay, that's excellent. Thank you very much for that. That's great. There's maybe one or two possibly, but I just want to keep going and do the summation. So Lindsay, 60 seconds.
Yes, so mostly indeed about the assisted dying is what I wanted to mention, to break that taboo that we're all advocates to actually discuss openly with people that have concerns about wanting to end their life, and to openly discuss this. Does that mean that you end their life? It is just an opportunity for people to express their feelings on various levels that contribute to the overall well-being of that particular person. So if you have that opportunity, if you have that chance to offer that listening ear, please do so. That's how we actually change the culture.
Okay, that's great. Thank you very much indeed. And then our next speaker, Karen.
I would like to stress the point of informed choice. So regardless of how things go, there has to be a real openness and transparency about conversations, and also the ability to factor human rights underpinning some of that. I guess what's really important here is that we need to be able to create those conditions to have the open and honest conversation. So going back to what I spoke about earlier is the sort of skilled end of life care and support that we deliver in care homes in Scotland. So we find that those sorts of conversations will crop up with care staff, and it's about making sure that that support network is available for those staff and that training is available for those staff to have those conversations as well.
Okay, thank you very much for that. And finally, Henry.
Well, I think I said everything I want to say. I just encourage anybody who believes in the importance of assisted dying and what I would regard in a humane and civilized society should do their utmost to campaign for it in whichever form they think is best.
Okay, thank you all for that. The two additional comments, really just very briefly, will not too much. Re-religiosity, the person, D. Jones, talks about the place of death and dying in the Bible. and how it's supported in that. And there's certainly plenty of passages which deal with death and dying. Of course, the obvious point to make as a minister is that the Bible is a Bronze Age document. Their issues were not our issues, and it's a question of their ethics were different from ours, their culture was different, so they didn't have to deal in the way we do with things like same-sex relationships. They don't have to deal with the environmental challenges that we do, and assisted dying would be another one of those issues as well. But there are certainly areas that people can draw from, use and abuse, I dare say. And Ian very kindly invites comment from me, but my role is to chair this meeting and not muddy the waters. Okay, folks, thank you very, very much indeed. I'm just trying to see if there's anything else. Faith in Older People is the organisation who offered support to people. Yeah, Faith in Older People is a very good organisation. It works certainly across Scotland. I was dealing with it when I was in Edinburgh for 20 years. It's a good organisation to look at for good resources. Folks, we are almost out of time, and I just want to say a huge thank you to all our speakers, to George, Lindsay, Karen and Henry, for your very stimulating contributions. We have all benefited from insights, a wealth of experience, and for you openly, vulnerably sharing. And that's precious and that matters, and we're not taking it for granted. So thank you. I want to thank also Amanda, the CEO, and also, most importantly, Sophie for managing all the technical wizardry, which I would be dead without. So, folks, thank you very much. Thank you very, very much indeed. We've had a good number of attendees throughout, and I'm absolutely sure that all of us have benefited from what's been said today. Enjoy the rest of your day. Take care. Thank you.